Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating with Zimperium. I'd like to welcome everybody to a very special webinar. We're actually very excited about this. We're excited about it for multiple reasons, which I'll dive into here in a quick second. But as we see people starting to be added in by the magic of Zoom, a few perfunctory comments, as we always like to say. We're going to try and keep this to around 30 minutes or so worth of content, and then Q&A at the end. Although you'll hear me say this frequently throughout, as well as the speakers, we actually do want this to be pretty interactive. And so we've got some questions we're actually going to tee up for you. We're going to show you the questions. If there are questions that you have around this whole topic, because let's be honest, zero trust has been overhyped. What is it? What isn't it? All that. That's very much why we're here to solve it. Send the questions in early and often, and we'll get to them. There will be an archived version of this up on the site before too long if you want to come back and check it out. And if you're interested in some of the slides, we can also make those available to you. So with that, we're going to dive in, and we're very excited about this. We're very excited for multiple reasons. One of the things is, at Zimperium, we don't believe in using terms, overhyping, saying that you instantly magically are protected against all ills of the world by buying our stuff. We don't believe in that. We also don't believe in product pitches in the middle of a presentation like this. So if you're looking for a product demonstration about Zimperium's tech, happy to take care of that for you, but that's not this session, right? This session is really more to help. It's more educational. And a lot of hype, a lot of conversation has come in around zero trust. We wanted to go to one of the smartest people we know, somebody that's completely independent, that's not dialed into each individual little component, and say, let's break this whole thing apart. So our guest speaker is a gent that's been doing security, mobility, everything for years and years and years, which is not to say he's old. It just means that he's got lots of experience. So our key speaker here, I'm going to introduce both speakers and then we'll dive in, is Phil Hochmuth from IDC. So Phil, great to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, JT. Thanks, appreciate it.
Definitely looking forward to it. And like I said, not saying you're old, just saying you're well experienced and seasoned. And then Phil's going to be joined by our director, Zimperium's director of product strategy for endpoint security. For those folks who don't know, no product pitch, but Zimperium, we protect enterprises against mobile risks. We do it in two ways. In the endpoints, the employees are using to access corporate data, and also within the apps that companies produce and put out into the marketplace. Richard has a long history from Cylance and a whole bunch of other endpoint securities. And so Richard will be bringing kind of the perspective of endpoint security from a Zimperium standpoint. So Richard, thanks for joining as well.
Of course, I'm super excited to learn a lot from Phil and hopefully keep up with him.
It's going to be fun. It's going to be fun. Yeah. There's no doubts. So with that, without any further ado, like I said, with this overhyped topic of zero trust, Phil, I'm going to turn it back over. I'll drive the slides for you. But any upfront comments you want to make about this, or would you like me to move to the next slide and start diving into the data?
Yeah, we can just start diving in because it's really going to help shape the conversation and get people aware of like why we're talking about zero trust and what this term means relative to the realities of the way people are working now. So we don't have a ton of slides for you guys today, but just some data points of our most recent research to really show what's happening in the enterprise, what's happening with the workforce. And as everybody probably knows and have seen just over the last 18 months or so from the pandemic, there's been a massive shift in the way people do work, where they work from, primarily with that shift to remote work, hybrid work, people being forced to not be in the office for long periods of time. And this is from a survey we did just in the first quarter of this year, kind of asking IT professionals to look out maybe 12, 18 months further from now. Where do you see your workforce working from in the next 12, by 2022? So how is that going to shape up? And what we're seeing here is really just a majority of enterprises are going to have some form of remote, hybrid, or a mix of the mix of the two work styles going forward. Only about 33% of workers really on average from the people we asked see them as being really truly on-site workers who have to be in the office. Pretty much the rest, over two-thirds or more of end users will be either dedicated remote workers or switching between environments, which is where you can get into some of the issues of security and challenges around technologies they use and the devices they use and things like that. So just a big shift in the workforce and the places they work, I think. Also, this affects the devices and the types of technologies they use. So if you have someone who's been used to working from home for maybe over a year, they've collected a group of devices probably that are a mix of their own endpoints, corporate endpoints, personal devices, mobile devices in a lot of sense that they're starting to use to build out their workspace. And this new workspace is going to travel, whether the people have to go back to the office or if they continue working from home or from a sort of a hybrid scenario.
So Phil, we didn't talk about this in the setup, but I was thinking about this last night, and the to a certain extent, even the 1/3 kind of surprised me. Do you remember from the data, was there anything in particular in terms of any particular industries or any particular sizes where there was like, it swayed it one way or the other? So like, obviously, if we're looking at a lot of retail, for instance, that might sway one direction, or manufacturing. But do you remember anything from the data in terms of verticals or company sizes or even maybe even regions?
Yeah, for sure. Regions vary very widely. Focusing on kind of the US though, it's like you said, yeah, a lot of certain sectors such as manufacturing, logistics, public safety, those are roles where they can't work from home. They have to be there. They have to be there in person. But what's interesting in those scenarios too is that their workspace is digitally transforming too. You're starting to see more retail workers with mobile devices for contactless checkout. The fleet of delivery people zooming around all over the place now all have some kind of connected endpoint. So yeah, those folks they still have to go to work. I mean, a lot of them are really, they're the heroes of kind of the pandemic, keeping the economy running. But they've also kind of been changed in terms of the way they do their digital day-to-day, because they're getting more devices, they're getting more technology really put in front of them. Even though they can't work from home, they still have a lot of these types of scenarios in front of them.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, it's going to be interesting going forward. And obviously this conversation is really around the devices themselves and security and how they fit in a zero trust framework. But I think the fealty of employees is starting to be tested. I don't know if you saw the article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, where they're talking about there's a huge rush or a huge spike in resignations. A lot of people, if they're being forced to go back into the office, they're saying, no. I want this. I want to be able to work remotely. Richard, any thoughts or comments or questions on this before we move to the next slide?
I think that this is something that, I think this research is going to change, not to dismiss IDC's research, but there's the mindset of the business. And then as JT just hit on, there's the mindset of the employee. There's always the wishes of the business to, bring people together and have this collective group and establish corporate culture. But how does an organization balance corporate culture with the needs of the corporate employees? And it's almost in a weird sense, the corporate employee now has almost more power. They can go, nah, I'm not coming back to the office. I've been remote for 5 years now. And, I'm actually in the office. I'm in the corporate office today. I flew in, and this is my little component, but this isn't routine. This isn't every day for me. And it's something that works for me. But if somebody wants to be like, hey, you have to be in the office every day, it's like, I am actually more productive when I work from home because I'm not in the car for 3 hours. I'm not doing this. And that's that balancing routine, that balancing act. And I really think it's going to impact not just what we're talking about today, zero trust and security, but it's going to impact a lot of components of how corporations are built and managed for the future.
Yeah, I agree completely. And so then it kind of leads into, as Phil kind of predicted it would, where do we go from here, Phil?
Yeah, so I mean, where we go is really a digitization of the way people work. I mean, Richard talked about the way he works and, maybe being more comfortable at home than in the office. But what it comes down to is the digital tools that you surround yourself with. And we kind of call this the digital workspace, or sort of like the digital day-to-day interface that people have. And what's going to happen is really that, first and foremost, this remote hybrid model is going to be the new normal. I mean, to use a tired phrase, but this is how people are going to have to deal with their workforce going forward. It's going to be people either entirely remote, as we saw from the other data point, or in that model where they're going back and forth. But sort of the old way of kind of butts and seats in the office 9 to 5, that's really over for a lot of industries. Certain industries, obviously, like we said, they have to have people there, but it's just going to be a more flexible environment. And what that dovetails into is that intelligent workspace idea, the concept of, your workspace isn't your cube in the office in the high rise with devices and things there, and that's the only place you can be productive. It's wherever you are. And the concept of any device, any app, that's been around for a while, this anywhere at working kind of concept, but it's really accelerated, and it's become more than just sort of a pie in the sky thing. A lot of people have really had to figure out how to do this quickly in the last 18 months. You hear a lot about people doing 5 years of acceleration in 18 months. That's definitely what's happening in that workspace kind of environment that end users have. And just to look at a few other things that people see down the line, what's going to last from the pandemic? Cloud, obviously, disconnecting on-premise devices, on-premise servers, moving more workloads to the cloud, automation. So all the sort of components that you sort of need to have around to support that flexible anywhere workspace. That's where people see being really the real impact of the pandemic over the long term, I think.
Yeah, for me, obviously the number one was, clearly number one, right? And it makes sense for all the reasons you, Richard, and I were just talking about, right? The corporate side of things, the employee side of things, et cetera. The third one down to me is, I'm actually kind of fascinated it's not higher. And it's probably a function of many things, but, there's a difference between a triage doctor and a plastic surgeon, right? When the pandemic hit, everybody went into triage mode. And to your point, they couldn't get devices out to everybody. Everybody had to get out of the office. Nobody knew what was going on. So you had to enable all these independent devices to come in. The first reaction that we saw, and we talked about this, everybody said, let's set up a corporate VPN. And everybody was backhauling everything to the office, but then where was it going from there?
Right.
Back out to the cloud. So it was like, wait a minute, why are we doing this? And as we start talking about zero trust, and what zero trust isn't a key component of it is, what are we going to access? We're making decisions of what we're going to give you access to on the fly, and the vast majority of that stuff is cloud-based. So to me, that was one that kind of popped out. What about you, Richard?
I think there's a larger conversation that from all these statistics of the technological limitations of the old way to do things. And when I say old way, 2 years ago, remote work was exactly that. You work remote, you log in through the VPN, you log into your corporate network. Well, VPNs are tunnels, and they're not, shaped with the same width the whole way. They kind of narrow down into more of a funnel style. And so when you have 100 employees, 200 employees, 1,000 employees, all of a sudden needing VPN access and logging in, there are some statistics that came out. Organizations were literally DDoSing their own infrastructure because they were trying to do everything over a VPN. So there is the technological limitations of the old way. And I hate to say it in the scheme of the loss that we experienced with COVID in terms of impact on human life and all, but some of the benefits that have come out of COVID. And I really do think that societally we have been set up for this because of the technology that exists elsewhere. We were able to pivot and adapt. We being society, were able to adapt and pivot to remote work and have solutions that were in place. Some, tested out, some not, but we were able to rapidly deploy out and figure it out. And in a year and a half, we have seen that 5-year acceleration that, as a technologist, none of us expected to be here a year and a half ago. None of us did. And it's exciting in a way to see that, but it's all because we have pushed the old legacy tech. We pushed it beyond where it could actually scale to.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I agree completely. And again, folks, just as a reminder, use the Q&A. If there's things in here where you're like, or use the Q&A, even if it's to say, hey, I agree, or I don't understand what you guys are saying about this, because we'd love your take on it. So, Phil, moving to the infrastructure, and as we're getting closer and closer towards the zero trust piece, backed up by data, little thoughts about the workplace infrastructure.
Yeah, and to Richard's point, that real first initial leaning on VPN, right? Like, okay, we just have to scale the VPN. That'll be our remote workforce strategy. So, that lasted for a short while, and then like you said, people realized the limitations of that, and basically a lot of folks realized we can't just recreate the old on-premise behind the firewall infrastructure for remote work. It has to be a new way of delivering digital technology to people. And when we ask what are your areas of increased spend in 2021, these are the four areas. The four areas that really stuck out to me were areas that are addressing the digital workspace, and that's workspace as a service. So being able to deliver like virtual desktop or sort of a contained environment to end users so they can work remotely. Endpoint management, secure remote access, and that's not necessarily VPN. That's technologies like two-factor authentication or conditional access controls, or some of the new types of technologies that we see evolving that kind of shift away from sort of the on-premise behind the firewall notions about how you protect end users and expand it and really push the data, really push the security controls closer to the data, closer to the identity, and not rely so much on devices and location and where you are for security. So I think these four conferencing platforms, obviously, you need that just to have a basic work when you're doing this remote type of work. But it was interesting to me see these technologies really being above a lot of other technologies you might assume, like collaboration or unified communications. It's that infrastructure for this new digital workspace that people are really going to be spending on.
This
And, Phil,
is foundation building. Oh, sorry, JT.
No, go ahead, Richard.
This is foundation building. Like, to me, when I look at the statistics, you can't have the stuff below, the unified communications, the application delivery, the collaboration platforms, until you have the foundation established. And again, going back to it, we pivoted so well into understanding that. Now, there are some organizations, as we've seen in the news, that didn't focus their efforts on secure remote access or data security, and unfortunately they are suffering the consequences of that misstep. Hopefully, as we go on in time, we all hope that the news teaches others that don't make those same mistakes. But this allows organizations to essentially establish a perimeter of one around their endpoints, because that's ultimately what it was. As soon as we walked outside the perimeter of the office, this little device, our tablets, our desktops, our laptops, every single device that was no longer in that security perimeter needed its own security, needed its own processes, needed its own management. And yet they had to build a perimeter around every single one of those devices in order to enable their employees to and be effective.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And it's funny, when I look at this slide, and we'll pop through the last two slides and get to the questions as well. And Phil, I've got my own biased opinion, but you're the expert and you're the one, looking at it from your perspective. This is probably a good place to kind of say, what is zero trust? And because in my mind, so many elements of what we just discussed here is really what zero trust is all about, And so, Phil, what is your high level, kind of perspective on what zero trust actually is and potentially isn't?
Yeah. I mean, there are some very technical definitions of zero trust around like microsegmentation and identity-based access controls and things like that. But what I think conceptually what it comes down to is just a shift in the focus of the security controls from location-based in terms of on-premise networks, the LAN, the WAN, the extended controlled network, and those controlled devices to untrusted environments. So being able to push security to the user and the data that they're using and the apps they're using, like kind of as Richard said, sort of wrapping around to sort of a perimeter of one around that one individual and what they're trying to do with technology. as opposed to just having a sort of a broad, umbrella of security that you try to gather everyone under. Really extending the security to the untrusted environments. To me, that's kind of one of the main focuses of any type of zero trust architecture, because like you said, you're bringing lots of new devices into the mix here. They're not going to be on the corporate LAN. They've probably never touched an on-premise IP address, but they're suddenly part of your workspace. You've got a tablet using for Zoom, you're using your mobile all the time. Maybe you're using a Mac or something that you procured yourself to be productive. But all of these things are just beyond the traditional security controls. So the controls have to go to where the data is, where the user is, and be pervasive and not just be sort of a slathered on kind of thing. It's got to really, and what the ultimate goal to me is making these untrusted environments trusted. So extending the trust to them so you can be productive with the technology.
Yeah, to me, that's perfect. To me, I kind of roll it up and say, at its core, what's it all about? And I would probably tweak what you said just a little bit. It doesn't mean I'm right. I'm probably wrong. But when I think about it, it's matching what I'm willing to give you as an enterprise based on the risk associated with you, your device, et cetera. So it's assessing the person, including where are they, et cetera, assessing the device. Is it BYOD? Is it up to date with its patches? Is it, what is the risk posture of the device? And based on those two, on the fly, say, here's the level of access of information I'm going to give you. But all of these elements like unified endpoint management and data security, I mean, it's funny because I think we have a lot of the pieces of a zero trust framework that have already been implemented largely, to your point to both you guys, over the last couple of years. We're actually in a great spot to be able to kind of do that sort of thing at this point in time. So in the interest of time, how about now back to the comment of, now potentially, and obviously this is you do mobile security, we do mobile security, mobile being part of that framework now. Phil, can you talk to us in terms of your research? And we've obviously got our own, but I think it's great looking at yours. What are the risks that mobile devices as a part of that zero trust framework are exposed to?
Well, the overall risk, I think, is just the increased reliance and importance of the mobile devices. Just there's more valuable data just coming to those devices and being on them. More critical work and workflows are going through iOS and Android devices. So that just increases the risk of use overall in general. But what we are seeing, talking to enterprise IT and security professionals, like what types of incidents do they see, on a daily or frequent basis? And here you see some pretty astounding things here, just in terms of the consistency of attacks that are being done on the end user of a business. So mobile phishing, malicious SMS, SIM jacking, SIM swapping, so being able to spoof somebody's identity through the mobile network. People are seeing a lot more of this type of activity, predominantly because I think a lot of the devices people are using are their own, and maybe they're unprotected. Maybe it's a personal BYO device, or the organization isn't just aware of the level of risk that these endpoints are introducing. As they become more of an integrated part of the workspace, sometimes they get left out of sort of the overall purview of risk and security and technology deployed to secure them. So it like you said, the zero trust concept is only metering out the level of access you deserve based on your risk posture. This is the area, I think, of risk that's probably becoming one of the largest blind spots, because people just always have assumed that these devices are secure, or there's low risk, or the operating systems are pretty, with sandboxing and the way iOS and Android are built, there's just less of a risk as to say like a Windows device, which has traditionally been the target of hackers. So it's becoming the issue of just more reliance on these devices for a critical component of the workspace, but sort of leaving out really considering their risk posture.
What I think is interesting, and Richard, I'd love your take on this. And this, by the way, dovetails almost perfectly with our research as well. In terms of what we look at it, because we've got the Z Labs, as you know, Phil, our mobile security research team, and they're all around the world and they're looking at all this stuff. The thing I think is interesting too is I think one of the biggest risks from a mobile security standpoint, which we'll even discuss a little bit more in the next slide, is the company thinking there's nothing I have to worry about on these devices. And minimally what we've seen, even on BYOD devices, we've seen two things, and you touched on one earlier, but minimally things like O365 and, getting access to Teams, getting access to email. I mean, it's like all of that stuff. You have valuable data on these devices, or data that is being transferred and consumed on those devices. The other one that people forget a lot about, and you touched on it a little while ago, Phil, is, are you using mobile devices for multi-factor authentication? So if down to, let's say, the bottom line there about rootkits or the device being compromised, things on those lines, if the device is compromised and you're using it for multi-factor authentication, the whole thing starts to fall apart. And so even as a part of the zero trust thing, if you're like, well, we're not sure how much we're really putting on mobile, blah, blah. If mobile is part of your overall authentication and identity, part of the identity and device component piece, you have to pay some attention. Richard, what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, it comes down to the human element. I'm going to give credit where credit is due. Both Google and Apple and all the phone manufacturers have done a really great job of selling this idea that this device, this little device that we put in our pocket, is a disposable unit, it's a disposable computer. We're encouraged to upgrade every 6 months, every year, new things, and they sell it and they sell it and they sell it. But ultimately, I think about the box of phones that I have in my house. I think about all the data that's on there, both private and work-wise, and how for a while, even as an endpoint guy, I never really thought about the security of what I was accessing, because there is that belief of that access. And but when it ultimately comes down to is the moment that a device connects into your corporate network, it is something that you need to be aware of, because malicious hackers are going to be using the path of least resistance. They are going to look at how are they going to get into your network? How are they going to get into your data? What are they going to steal? It could be through phishing. It could be, hey, they're going to take over one of your corporate-owned devices or a device of an executive. It gets down to that point of, we've seen it in the news. We've seen the ambassador of Australia, his phone gets hacked through a phishing link. Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, his phone got hacked through a WhatsApp link. It happens. And if it's targeting these people who should have some of the best security in the world and their devices, then it's definitely happening on the corporate network. It's definitely happening to the regular employees of the corporations, because they're looking for those ways in. Most attackers do not want to be a profile. They don't want to be in the news, because that means the spotlight is on them. And so they're looking for these devices, and the mobile device, because of the marketing that is around it, has become that path of least resistance.
Yeah, and when you talk about land and expand, right? Like we've seen, and Phil, we talked about this, our research team, we've seen a lot of malware that once it gets onto the mobile devices, the first thing it does whenever that device connects to a new Wi-Fi is it scans the devices that are also connected to Wi-Fi to see if they're susceptible to WannaCry. So, it's a path in and across. And this, the last slide we have, folks, and we're going to finish wrapping up the questions. So again, we're going to run through this. This kind of explains it, right? Richard, you were talking about it, and Phil, what does it say to you in terms of the amount of spend per device between these various different components at this point in time? And how do you see it potentially changing as a function of this new remote working, zero trust, et cetera, world?
Yeah, I mean, here you see just the disparity between spend on a device per device basis, whether you talk about PC or mobile. This isn't survey data. This is data from our IDC trackers, where we track the actual installed base of the number of mobiles and Windows PCs in production in enterprise environments. And if you mix that with our security spend, you see really that gap that we've been talking about $33 per PC device spent on average for security in the enterprise versus about $5 per mobile. both of those growing over time. Obviously, as the mobile and endpoint security markets grow, people are putting more dollars into security, into AI technologies for threat detection, EDR, XDR, all these things. People are really, it's a gold rush kind of thing where they're really looking to spend money on these things. But where they're focusing on, obviously, the Windows threat is probably the first and foremost in front of most IT decision makers and security professionals. Windows has traditionally been the #1 target for endpoints, but like you said, mobile is getting overlooked, and it's the personal nature of the mobile device that makes it most vulnerable. If it's really the way you authenticate, or if it's if you can sort of take over the identity of the person with the device, maybe not stealing the data off of it. There's not too many ransomware sort of incidents around mobile itself, but it's a way in for those other more insidious types of attacks. And over time, you're not necessarily saying you have to spend as much on your mobile device security as you do on your endpoint from a PC, but just thinking about this disparity is probably something that most enterprise security professionals should be thinking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I agree. So, folks, we're at the bottom of the hour, and we told you we were going to try and gun for about 30 minutes worth of content, and then we're going to run into the Q&A. So here are some of the questions that I'm going to ask Phil and Richard, and we're going to do it with a little bit of tempo here, even though we've been enjoying ourselves, and hopefully you've been enjoying it as well. The reason we're teeing these questions up for you in advance is if there's a question that you have that is not on this list, throw it in the Q&A. If there's anything you want to ask Phil, anything you want to ask Richard, just throw it in the Q&A, and we'll try and get to it as quickly as we can. So here are the questions that I'm gonna run through with you guys. So let's obviously start with the first one, and we can all read, but I'm going to do it anyway because I get to play moderator, right? With the expectations of the future of work, do you think security mindsets will change with it? And I think we've already been hitting on some of this, but Phil, what is your thoughts on this question first, and then Richard will back it up behind Phil.
Yeah, I think they've already changed. I think a lot of organizations have came to realize pretty quickly that implementing sort of the way they used to do endpoint security and network security on this new sort of remote and hybrid workforce it doesn't scale, and they have realized that. And you saw from sort of the spending plans that people had for 2021, it was more focused on cloud-based security, security tools and technologies that follow the end user, follow the endpoint, are more adhered to the data itself. I think that is going to continue to change. I think as we get into kind of the next phase of the experiment of, I don't know if we call it post-pandemic or year 2 or whatever, but as we get back to sort of normal in the office, there's a lot of back to work initiatives. You're going to see mindsets change again, I think, as people have to deal with the fluid presence of where people are. They're going to be working from home, from remote, from different places all over, just in that hybrid model, as you saw. So just being able to have security that can follow them, not just them, but their device and the apps and the data, that's really going to be what people have to sort of think about. Just a shift away from that, almost sort of the nail in the coffin of sort of the traditional on-premise firewall VPN kind of approach to security, I think is where you'll see the big change.
Yeah, Phil, you're absolutely right. The old way of inside means trusted, and when they're inside the building means trusted, is not going to work when we all return to the office. Because as to your earlier point, people have been working with their own devices. They've been using their tablets. They have established a new workflow that is outside the corporate ecosystem of devices provided. They're including it because it's made them more efficient. It's worked better for their style of working. And so, even as I walked in here in the office, there's a no phone zone. Well, I was thinking, okay, well, I'm going to go connect my personal device to the Wi-Fi. I'm hitting up the IT manager. How do I do that? But that's one person right now. We're going to see that increase. We're going to see, the number of devices per user go from 1 provided by the corporation to 3 to 4 because of these workflows that we have all come to get used to over the past year. And so that mindset is going to have to be flexible. Now, on that flip side, I don't agree that everybody has seen or everybody's security mindset has improved. The organizations that have had to pivot and move beyond their borders to work beyond the office walls, absolutely. But some of those, those legacy organizations where they've worked on site, we've seen them in the news, they've been hacked, they've been breached because they didn't have the security mindset. Unfortunately, they've been losing big. But I think the biggest news that came out recently was a major financial institution has reported they're spending $1 billion a year on cybersecurity. And for somebody to come out there and say, we're investing, we are doing this, everyone else is kind of go, oh crap, if they're doing that, we should probably be as well. So I think it's going to flow down. I think it's going to inspire others to start approaching security with a better, more proactive mindset.
Yeah, I agree. And, in the interest of time, I'm probably not going to go through all these questions. And since I'm in charge temporarily, I get to decide. It's just the way it works. And we're getting some great questions. So folks, one of the things that I'm calling an audible right now, we're going to be writing a blog talking about this. We'll even put in some of the answers to some of these questions, even if we don't get to them, because I'd rather get to the questions that you guys are asking as a general rule, right? So guys, one of the first questions that came in was, with trust being pushed to the edge, how important is tamper-proofing applications that hold valuable data? Phil, do you want to take a first shot at that?
Yeah, it's very important. It really becomes the way you secure your enterprise, as opposed to securing the device or the network or sort of the ancillary things around it. A big kind of component or sort of philosophy of zero trust is security adheres closer to the user, the apps, and the data. So yeah, I mean, the more that you can bulletproof apps that you're developing, certainly if you're developing applications in-house for your end users, whether it's the workforce or just line of business applications, just considering that the security, these apps really should be built almost bulletproof to some extent, because you have to figure these apps are going to be accessed by untrusted environments, unmanaged endpoints. It's not going to be just creating, whipping up a quick productivity app, maybe like you did in the past from a developer standpoint. You have to almost be thinking like a consumer app developer in terms of securing the app from transactions, it being out in the wild, basically. What possible tampering could happen to it, because that's how it's going to be used. It's going to the new normal of how people are going to be operating is out in the wild. It's not going to be, there are going to be no real protections around your code from an IT security standpoint.
Yeah, I agree with 100%, Phil. I mean, that's one of the things that is a mind shift that people need to get their arms around, is that traditional apps were all the servers that ran those apps and everything we owned. And it was behind firewalls. And it was, when you do mobile apps, you produce this thing and you drop it into the attacker's hands because you put it in the public app store so they can take it, play with it. And then to your point, it's running on devices that the users, the admin, and so you need to, it's all part of the zero trust play, that we're talking about. Related to this topic, Richard, this is a question for you. So for mobile, at least iOS and Android, each app run in sandboxes and can't see other apps. For me, that means mobile antivirus, and the idea of scanning on mobile platforms doesn't have sense because AV doesn't have access to the apps and can't scan or analyze them. Obviously, this is part of our core intellectual property, but what do you think about that? So I think fundamentally, part of the question is mobile.
What's the point of it if it's in a container? What's the point of it if it's in a sandbox? I think that's the point of it, right? I'm excited. Marcin, great question, solid question. I didn't pay him to write that. If he hits me up with his PayPal link, maybe I will buy him a coffee. No, that's a great question, because that is the traditional sense. Hey, this app is built inside this container. It can't impact others. Well, that's not true anymore. Now these apps can request accessibility controls. You've got keyboard applications that you're downloading on your Android devices. You've got these applications that are coming through. Hey, I want to request access to your notifications. They're putting overlays on your screen. Now, let's change the mindset as well. Traditional AV, as in what goes on our laptop, the old school way of scanning for viruses, yeah, that's not the way you need to be approaching mobile endpoints, because that's a modern operating system, as the man kind of coined that term. The modern operating system has containerized applications. What you should be looking at is an advanced mobile threat defense platform or product that is looking for the risks, looking for those leaky buckets, kind of going back to that previous question, how do you future-proof an application? Well, if that application is not configured properly, shouldn't you as the administrator know that there's potential risk within that application because, hey, it is something that we've coined the term leaky buckets. Hey, this cloud configuration has vulnerabilities and risks that are exposing the data that is being stored within that application or that access that it has up to the cloud. So it's not the traditional AV sense, back to the signatures, back to the old school AV. We're looking at mobile threat defense and the machine learning advanced risk prevention kind of approach, which is becoming an ingredient to zero trust. You cannot have zero trust if you forget about mobile. You cannot have a full zero trust architecture within your ecosystem if you're skipping over looking at these applications. Now, Marcin, I'm going to finish up real quick with one point. You bring up that idea that these apps aren't doing anything malicious. Well, they are. If you sideload an application, it could potentially be taking over those access controls, getting accessibility and control to look at your keyboard, watch what's being typed, monitor and scan your screen. T-bot, flu-bot, we just saw these recently. These are applications that were sideloaded in, delivered through phishing links, tricking Android users, specifically impacting the EMEA market. Hey, you have DHL, you have a UPS package, you've got a FedEx package, and they looked legit. And these applications would start by requesting access of your keyboard. And the user, which is typically the problem in the security world, accepts it because we have been trained to accept all pop-ups. Just say yes, get a deal with, don't read it, just accept yes. And so you have this pop-up come in, you've given control to this side-loaded application. Now it's sitting and waiting for you to load up your banking app. It's waiting for you to load up your two-factor authentication app. It has control to see, to enact, to load, because we, the traditional user, not the security mindset user, click yes. And so ultimately, if we are not approaching that, we are not bringing that into our zero trust architecture, if we are not bringing that into our security mindset, we are leaving massive gaps in our full security architecture, that attackers are going to and are exploiting.
Yeah, and I would, I agree with you 100%, Richard, and we'll move on to the next question. I would actually up-level the answer a little bit. Everything Richard was saying, completely spot on and factual. But I go back to Phil's research a couple slides ago, where malicious apps was like the third or fourth point down there. When Phil writes his mobile threat management marketscape, and he covers the market, it covers phishing, malicious networks, malicious apps, device issues, risks, compromises, etc. You need all four because they're all directly related. As Richard was talking about, malicious apps might be a way that they deliver an exploit to compromise the device. Phishing might be the way that they trick a user into elevating privileges to compromise a device, right? So you need that kind of holistic view. Antivirus by itself, I personally wouldn't recommend investing in it. Phil, back here, just a couple more points. I mean, this has been great, and I'm sure people would want to go. Let's go down to that second to the last bullet, because this is all about, again, demystifying and providing some practical advice around zero trust. What are organizations missing when it comes to the advanced security architectures? I mean, we've talked about mobility obviously being a potential blind spot. What are some of the things that you've seen that you're consistently having to remind people or point things out? Hey, don't forget this.
Yeah, I think one of the major things is kind of to the point that we were just discussing, like what's the point of having an AV on a mobile if it can't see anything? It's not so much the focus on looking at the vulnerabilities of apps or devices or even network, not just focusing on those specific unique things, but the activity, basically looking at it holistically in people. How are people behaving with the combinations of technology, and being able to do baselines of normal activity versus anomalies. That's probably something that most people overlook. And they do that kind of approach at a technology level. Like they do have, like in terms of network, network behavior analysis, you do analyses of things like that. But I think there's people really missing kind of the forest for the trees kind of thing, is like, what is the end user doing? How are they using all these things in concert? And how might deviations from that be signals for, like you said, elevating access control privileges, more challenges for conditional access? I think there's just kind of been somewhat of a disconnect between all the pieces of stuff people use to do their job versus the actual body of work that they're doing, and what that looks like versus what it should be looking like. That's kind of a disconnect I see a lot of organizations have.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then to finish out, since we are talking about mobile security here, and Richard mentioned, the modern OS, right? The mobile OS with apps being in containers, as Marcin had pointed out, the operating system being locked down. There's some architectural elements of mobile, which is becoming the blueprint for the modern OS. There, a lot of the traditional endpoints and servers and certainly IoT, they're starting to take from that approach. And as we've all kind of joked about, putting all the E's in EDR, right? It's like 60% of the E's right now that are accessing the enterprise are mobile, 40% are traditional. But as those worlds start to converge, do you see the spend needs to converge as well? Or how do you see those pieces in terms of, we're putting mobile security, but even modern OS security, should it start heading towards an endpoint, even if it's not 100%? But what are your thoughts about that? Not only the need, but even the spend, kind of how they might be trending.
Yeah, I think the spend is going to trend in a couple ways. I think number one will be not necessarily on a categorization of technology for security, but underlying enablers of it. So AI, we talk about AI a lot, and that gets overhyped a lot. But I think the ability to use large data sets to find anomalies in the way people behave, to detect something going wrong, not necessarily with the device, to say, oh well, this piece of the operating system has been compromised, or this app is malicious, but something about the way this end user is doing what they do that isn't what they normally do. Having the ability to sort of see that from a visibility standpoint, spending on technologies like that, I think, is going to be kind of the more strategic way people will think about it. You'll always have requirements to spend on certain technologies because of regulatory, PCI, things like that, HIPAA. But I think the shift in spend will be more towards broader technologies that can really not necessarily drill down into one type of device or one type of component of the network, but really the workspace. Like, can you look at the workspace that this person has? Is there something anomalous in their digital day-to-day, whether it be mobile, Mac, Chrome, being able to connect those dots and then take action on it? That's going to be kind of, I think, the future of spending will be on technology towards that end, to my opinion.
No, I agree completely. Well, guys, thank you so much for your time. Everybody, thank you for hanging with us. Obviously, we went a little bit longer than we wanted, but that's great questions that folks dropped in. I would like to thank Richard and Phil. Thank you guys both for joining us in Perspective. Like we said, we'll be putting up a blog. We'll make sure that we cover some of these questions as well. But any last comments? Richard, let me start with you. Any last comments or thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I want to kind of hit on something that Phil said and kind of bring it into a different mindset. It also hits on Marcin's question that he asked, because I think it's a great question. Does the stuff that's in the app stores, does it work? Is that going to solve it? Ultimately, I don't necessarily think that organizations need to be spending as much on mobile endpoints as they do on traditional endpoints, but they need to be approaching the mobile endpoint with the same mindset that they approach their traditional endpoint. Can we bring advanced technology into it? And to Marcin's question, do these home products work? We're on the App Store, Zimperium's on there, but not just to sell us, but to sell the technology. Organizations shouldn't just be checking the box to meet compliance. What they should be doing is researching and finding out, does this product meet the needs, not for today, but for tomorrow? because we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. So is it going to allow my employees to be flexible and secure? It's going to allow them to come and go and be secure. Does it check that box within the compliance, but also meet the needs of my security operations center? That's where I think that we should be focusing on. And that's my last point.
No, that's perfect, Richard. And just to add one point to that, something we haven't discussed a lot here, but is absolutely critical in this new world is privacy. When you're dealing with BYOD devices and the like, in addition to everything, Richard, you were just saying, because again, that what we talked about at the very beginning, that there's the business side and there's the employee side, right? If you're implementing solutions to protect BYOD and you're not protecting their privacy, it's not going to work. It just won't. And so that's another part of the cube, the Rubik's cube, as you're shifting it around, that you need to consider. Phil, any last comments, thoughts on this whole topic?
Yeah, you make a good point about privacy, and that really expands in sort of the big picture of what we're talking about. It's how do you extend security to these new workspaces that are a mix of corporate and personal technologies, and being able to have broad enough solution visibility to really handle anything, because they're going to be working from anywhere. They're going to be using anything. People want to be productive. They don't ultimately have malicious intent in terms of how they use technology. So they're going to use what they can get a hold of to do their job and be productive. And it's really up to IT and security sort of to be nimble to that perspective and not think about how do we secure the stuff we give the worker. It's how do we secure the digital day-to-day of the end user. That's really the concept, I think.
That's perfect. Hey guys, thank you very much for your time. Phil, as always, it's been great catching up. Richard, I get to see you all the time, but it's great to see you anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you guys very much again. We'll put an archived version up on the website. There'll be a blog covering some of the key points. And if you have any questions at all and want to even dive further, whether it's for Richard or for Phil, let us know and we will facilitate that. So with that, I will wish everybody a great day. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.